as you all have gone about your research, talk to us a little bit about your process. How did you get into this topic? Where did you go to uncover this story? Who did you talk to? If you can, we've got a number of educators who've joined us, and obviously there may be some students here too. Talk to us about your research process. Erica, you want to start with us?
Sure, I'll start. Just as me and Adam were talking about earlier, I was born and raised in Milwaukee, and I did not learn about the open housing marches until I was a 20-something-year-old graduate student. So I was very surprised that, this had happened. Even when I was a senior at Riverside, I had the pleasure of taking an African American history course. And we learned about the Southern movement, but we did not learn about the local movement at the time. I didn't even know that there had been a local movement. So once I got older, became a graduate student, I started learning more and more about the movement. I became very interested in the Milwaukee NAACP Youth Council and their various campaigns throughout the 1960s. I decided to write my thesis on the Milwaukee NAACP Youth Council, which you were on my committee, Robert. And so, of course, a big chunk, the thesis was from 1948 to 1968. And so a big part of their history, their biggest campaign, their most popular campaign, probably their longest campaign, is the open housing campaign. And so I actually dedicated a whole chapter to that particular campaign. And once I finished writing the thesis, it was important to me to not just sit on that research, but to publish it so that other people who were interested in this history, didn't know about this history like I had been, could have access to this history. So that's kind of how I got into,
Erica, if you wouldn't mind, I have right here. I have this right here. So here's the thing: is we were so taken by the articles that you wrote. The Wisconsin Historical Society gave us their whole backlog of the issues they were published in. And then I gave away all of them and kept none for myself. So I had to print these off from the PDF. People were really wanting these things. And Erica, I just want to say this, and this other one that you wrote. So I printed off these pages, Commanding a Movement. When I read this article, I, like you, didn't know this story. I started meeting youth council members, talking to commandos. Someone shared this link with me. I read it. 3 pages in, I was both exhilarated and furious. Exhilarated because of how you did such an incredible job of unpacking that story, but I was furious because it was like, why don't I know this already?
Yeah.
And
yeah.
I actually think telling people to read a PDF or a magazine article, like, if I could make everyone in Milwaukee do one thing, it would be reading that specific article. It can be a hard sell, but I just want to say to you, like, frankly, I would not be involved in this work if it weren't for Commanding a Movement, that article you wrote.
Wow.
So thank you for for giving me a space for these last 3 years to feel like so motivated to share this with other people.
Awesome.
Thank you.
And when I
That's
say
exactly what my goal was.
and when I say thank you, I also mean Rob and I have both been doing so much work on this. It's also like a thanks, Erica, for for lighting a fire that I'm still stoking and still a little like, man.
No, thank you guys for the work that you're doing.
Patrick, your title, Selma of the North, it sort of looms in both its scholarly impact and punch, but then also as we look into our current highly politicized moment, our current racial geographies, it still sort of sits with us. How'd you come up with that title? How'd you get into this thing?
Yeah, well, when I was a grad student, I was born in Baltimore and grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. Similar contours of race, both on the positive side, the incredible history of African-American history in a place like Cleveland, first major city to have an African-American mayor. Langston Hughes publishes his first poems there, rich musical history, etc. But also the worst of race and inequality. So, I grew up, Tim Tyson, who's one of the great movement scholars, was my advisor at Wisconsin. And I was doing work on the Southern movement, but knew there were these Northern movement stories that weren't being told. Sociologists talked about them, and sometimes as when they talked about the ghetto and their language, but there really wasn't movement history being done on the North. So I wanted to do that because that's where I grew up, and I was initially going to do Cleveland, but I, like all of you, began to hear about the Milwaukee movement and the open housing campaign and this commandos and this curious figure of Father Grappi, et cetera, and was amazed that nobody had written about it and that nobody that was from there seemed to really know about it. I taught and I would teach, white students and black students at UW, and I would do a lesson always on this. And students would come to me sheepishly after class during my office hours or in the hallway and say, I'm from Milwaukee and I'm ashamed to say I didn't know anything about this. Or maybe they'd kind of vaguely heard this name, Father Grappi, and it held some attachment, like it was either negative or positive, but they didn't really know anything further about it. So, I didn't really have a model for work on the Northern movement. I had a lot of assumptions. So Milwaukee was available. One of the things that's great for teachers and students is there's just a rich array of materials that are available. They were in the Urban Archive and the Historical Society. Now they have largely been put online through the March on Milwaukee web project. So you can access those. And there's just an incredible amount of organizational records, personal records, flyers, leaflets, images that, each one is, a great tool for a teacher to open up various aspects of this conversation. So I started with a massive amount of just documents and archives. I went through daily newspapers, African American Press, Underground Press, the two different daily newspapers over more than a decade of time. And then I just began to meet people and do oral histories. And those stories are enriching in such important ways beyond the existing historical record, the archival record. And there's more of that to be done, particularly with everyday people who participated. So I would encourage teachers and students, that's something you can keep doing with your students, is to have them do oral histories and to talk to their family, talk to their neighbors, and they don't have to be lengthy. I did lots of them with people like Vel Phillips and Lloyd Barbie. They were long, and many of them, but even 15, 20 minutes about how different kinds of people remember these events and if they participated or just how they perceive them, even if they weren't directly involved, and what they thought it meant for the community. This is really important and enriching. And the other thing I would say is for teaching is that there are lots of things still out there. Lots of people took pictures, lots of people kept things, and there's other archival stuff out there in people's possession that are not in the archives we have. So doing a kind of history harvest where you invite people to bring out things that they might still have could be a really wonderful opportunity for a teacher and students to engage this, and also to help continue to build the foundation of historical artifacts on this. I would say one challenge in this that I think is just really interesting that remains is this issue again of massive white resistance. What is like jaw-droppingly shocking when you tell these stories is the massive white response and the violence and the numbers, and people are like, holy moly, what the heck is going on? Why didn't I know this? And one of the challenges as a scholar or a teacher is that, the civil rights organizations largely kept their records. The NAACP gave their boxes of stuff to the Historical Society, but most of the people, we have images, we have articles from the paper, pieces here and there. The letters that were written to Father Grappi and some other politicians are a really great insight into white reaction. But largely that's a challenge to get at, because the organizations, the closed housing organizations, they didn't keep their records and give them to the Historical Society. And when you go and try to talk to those people 50 years later, and they were holding white power signs or a Nazi symbol or something like that, a lot of them don't want to sit down and have an interview with you that you're recording to use in a book to tell you how and why they were involved with white reaction. And so a big challenge for us is, how do we get access to understanding white racism and white reaction to this? How do we document it? and how do we learn from that? Because if we really want to untangle white supremacy and racism, we have to understand the material circumstances out of which those people's feelings and perceptions and things are happening. And if they didn't collect things and keep them and give them to the historical society or what have you, and they're not willing to do interviews with us, how can we get at that in new and creative ways? So that's a huge challenge on this kind of thing.
A few quick responses to that is I kind of, in my mind, I know those white power signs are in a garage somewhere in the western or southern suburbs. And one thing I think is that, you know, the racism was archived in the concrete of the highways, you know, in the concrete of the infrastructure that was built in Milwaukee in the subsequent 50 years. Another one, to an earlier point you made, a friend of mine just posted on Facebook, literally as we're talking, that he had two uncles who were part of the movement. And anytime he hears it mentioned, he's really proud. Rob and I have seen this over and over when we give these talks, is we get people come up to us afterwards, because we've done this all in all these different settings, saying my aunt, my uncle, they'll shout out in the middle and say, hey, there's my dad, or something like that. So a lot of these folks are still around. And to that point, Patrick, after your talk at the Historical Society a couple years ago, I got to sit next to Mary Arms, who I've talked to before. And at the King and I, she told me some of my most treasured stories that I know about the open housing marches. And actually, because it wasn't a formal interview, like we were just kind of gabbing, and Mary kind of like whispered some things to me. I was like, Mary, that's incredible. And I don't know if she's told that to the historical record in the past. Like, yeah, so there's so many stories out there. That's one of the things I think is really motivating. I agree with you, for teachers and students, is that sometimes you can get in your classroom a marcher who will tell you stories that historians would die to know, you know?
Right, that's the good stuff. We're going to start moving toward some Q&A, just to make sure we keep our timing a little bit on track. But I want to also highlight that Kristen Leffelman from the Wisconsin Historical Society, she's dropping materials in the chat for us, folks. So you're getting some resources. Want to shout out the Wisconsin Historical Society one more time, and it's an awesome job collecting, preserving, and then disseminating and sharing this history. Want to shout the March on Milwaukee archives that Patrick mentioned earlier over at UWM. You can find that online just by searching March on Milwaukee. It'll show up pretty easily there for you. So we've got some great institutions who are doing phenomenal work preserving our history and the rich history of this particular moment in the nation's civil rights saga.